for vaping at school? Small technical difficulties, this too shall pass.
Local high schools, and it's 2 hours per night. And generally, a student and parent would both enroll in that class, and both the parent and the student would attend. And if both student and parent do attend that class, then the consequences that they receive on the school side as far as a suspension are greatly reduced. And so typically you'd be looking at 2 days of in-house suspension and 1 day of out-of-school suspension. If the student and the parent choose not to enroll in those courses, then the amount of time that a student can be suspended out of school increases.
Yeah, at Frank Church, our quarter system is a little bit different than traditional high school, so we do 9 weeks. We do an entire semester in 9 weeks, so when we look at the 5-day suspension, our goal is to keep kids in school. So students choose not to do the tobacco cessation classes or the survival classes. It's a first-time offense. We look around 2 or 3 days out, and then the rest of it in-house. Just doing the 5 full days is detrimental to our kids, and our whole goal is to have them at school. And then the second offense, no matter what, we're looking at 5 days out just because they obviously didn't learn their lesson the first time. But the biggest thing is our goal is trying to keep them in school. Parents will come back usually a lot of time the second time if they chose not to do the classes the first time. I have a lot of parents that come back the second time saying that they want to do the classes, they want to do the COMQ15, which is an outside source that comes in and does a drug assessment with the student, and has been I have seen a lot of times when behaviorally for that student, they see them re-offend, which has been nice. Some do, but it is nice that way. So far that went for the sun. Am I talking about?
Okay, so let's see if can we get our sound people to check on this mic check right here? Yeah. Let's see if we can get it to work here. So sorry about that.
And I would just echo what we've said up here in regards to our goal is to have the students be in school. Our goal is not to have additional suspension days. We really do encourage, whether it's the COMQ15, that risk assessment of the student, which can be done within the school setting. An outside provider comes in, but it's done during the school day, or those classes. And we do see very few offenders through that process. Of course, there's always situations where families may choose to have those additional suspension days and not have the counseling or the classes. But we really try to work with families in order to encourage students to be in school so that they can be in that educational setting and also be provided the support that they need.
Okay, thank you.
And there is one other aspect of it that sometimes, well, it's always involved, particularly at the high school level with the SROs that we have at the school, is the legal component of it. You know, you have to be 18 to be vaping, and so quite often the students that we have vaping are not of age. So, you know, there can be a legal consequence as well. At Boise High, we handled it in one of 2 ways. Last year, we primarily would have the officer issue the student citation, and then we would hold on to it for the next year. And if the student didn't have any further offenses, then we would discard that ticket. But moving this year, we've kind of moved away from that, and we've started issuing citations from the school resource officer as well.
this parent right here, if we come down and get this card here in front. Do you see someone coming down around here? Okay, so one of the questions that came up, panel, was this. What can state agencies like Project Filter or Office of Drug Policy do to support e-cigarette education and prevention in schools?
We're near Frankfurt, we have a community school, and we've actually had some different communities outreach to us and bring in different components, posters, presentations. We've had a lot of students attend some of the presentations we held in the community center at lunch, and you know, they learn something new every day. I think they think a lot of us is like, oh, it's not as bad as smoking a cigarette or as bad as blah blah blah, whatever they think, and having these other agencies come in and do presentations during lunch or during some of your health classes possibly would be another great idea. I think would help our students understand, because a lot of our students, a lot of my students I've noticed, they vape because they're either trying to quit smoking cigarettes, and they're like, and it's also cool to do, right? And they don't really realize the impact that it has on their health, and bringing in that education I think would really help.
So, this was phrased how big of a problem is it, but I think I'd rather change it to kind of describe the problem that vaping presents in the schools. So if one of you take that.
You know, you have to be 18 at this point in order to vape. It's considered an e-cigarette, and so certainly there is that component that we have to address because it's against policy to have those products on campus or certainly to be using them. But a huge part of it is this miseducation or misunderstanding of the use of it. It's this disruption during the school day. You know, we really try to monitor and to supervise free time, those unstructured times, passing periods. It's those situations where students are clumping up together, or maybe it's just individuals, whether it's in a bathroom, whether it's in a locker room. And so trying to continue the school day without disruption. They don't have those e-cigarettes oftentimes are providing that extra nicotine. It can affect concentration. It can affect, it can sometimes lead to irritability depending on how often you've been vaping, how much you've been vaping. So those things can certainly disrupt the school day as well. But really we try to create a safe, really safe environment at school, and we're trying to be more preventative with that.
Yeah, the impact with the addiction is, I would say, probably the largest that I see. Students have a hard time making it through the entire day. That's a lot of times how I connected with for a student with a vape is that, oh, I talked to my buddy and he always brought their friends out. And I got from so-and-so, they both come in and like, oh yeah, you want to see me off my vape in the bathroom or whatever. And they have, that's what they do. They go to a break, they do it at lunch, and you know, and it's just one of those things that it's an addiction to them, just like smoking cigarettes. I mean, I know my students that smoke their cigarettes, they have to leave campus to go do that. Luckily they do. But if I were to take them and have to keep them there all day, they would get busted somewhere or another. But that's the biggest thing, is that they just cannot make it through the day. And with the irritability and impacting their missing out on education because they need to go use the restroom or whatever, and they hide it. So it's one of those things for us to try to stop it. We're trying, but it's definitely been difficult.
I think it can have, it certainly has a social impact as well. For the students that are vaping, but I think also for the students that are choosing not to vape, that are entering our restrooms or on our school buses or in our hallways or classrooms, that are being exposed to the students that are vaping. So that creates a little bit of a social divide as well. We do get a lot of feedback from students when that type of behavior is occurring. And so I think that's an important aspect of it too. And then you have the safety concern of having multiple students packed into a stall in a bathroom and some of the issues that can create too. So I think there's a social and safety component to it as well, in addition to the health effects that it's having.
So this next question came up a couple of times. So panel, how do you tell the difference between if they're just vaping or if it's just nicotine or even marijuana? Or can they vape and do all of those things while they're vaping? So maybe address the different components of not just something that, you know, is cherry flavor vaping, and then there's nicotine and marijuana involved. Can you kind of address that as well, please?
Yeah, so anytime that we have a student that has been vaping on campus, and we're able to retrieve that vape, we always have our school resource officer test it. A really quick test that they can open up the little kind of compartment where they would squeeze the juice into, and they can stick a strip in there, and depending on the color, will indicate whether it's just nicotine or if there is THC in it. So we test all the vapes that we confiscate.
And smoking, tobacco, drugs, alcohol, all falls under the same policy. So as far as consequences, that's what we look at. So if an individual has a vape that has THC or that has vape juice, or if it doesn't have alcohol, the first consequence is the same. And then if there's no offense, we still look at the same policy, and the second consequences are the same, which is the suspension, or the school suspension.
And I know a lot of your question about the vapes, so I would also tell you that when you go into the gym, they have all the different types of vapes, and they're not all of them. From all the ones I've seen that we have on there, every single one of them can be modified to have marijuana in them. And ones that we didn't think could have marijuana in them get tested, and like, oh, it has marijuana in them. So that is something that is constant, that's ever changing in our society right now, how the different, how they change and how you can manipulate them. The other thing with them is there's times we can't test for what's actually in it, so they might do things such as crush up pills, put them in the oil and smoke them, and you don't even know what it is. And so that's the scary part with vapes, is that they know how to modify them and put something else in it to get their high.
I would say also a key component is knowing the students that you're working with, and when you're interacting with those students, what is typical for a student when you're interacting with them. And if you do have concerns with their demeanor or their speech or how they look or their affect, I think that's an important time where you're including the health professionals in the building and the nurse, so that they can come and check out the student and do their vitals to see if there's anything else going on. Of course, contact the parents to ensure that there's no illness going on that you may be unaware of. And so I think including the nurse and knowing the students and is important as well.
So we have time for one more question before we make a transition to our medical panel, but this is kind of a two-part thing. So it's, what if a student isn't using it in school? So I'm interpreting that by maybe it's at a football game or some other activity, so it's off school grounds, so are there still consequences for vaping? And then a follow-up question with that. So I want to be able to remember this. What about if they weren't caught on school grounds at all, but the parents are interested in the child being involved in a 6-week cessation program? Is that something they can sign up for? So what happens if you're at a school function, even if it's away from the school grounds themselves, and can a person sign up if they wanted their child involved?
So any school-sponsored activity, the consequences for vaping remain the same. So whether you're at a football game or a play or a concert, any type of school-sponsored activity, that can even be an out-of-state trip for athletics, the same consequences apply.
Yeah, and I have parents all the time come in and ask, can they enroll their students, and we say yes. At our school, and I know a lot of the other high schools and junior highs, we have different groups that we run to help students with nicotine addiction, alcohol addiction, anything like that. So, I mean, we are there to help parents, to give them resources, to get them to get their help for their kids.
And the classes that are put on for the tobacco cessation or any of the other classes that we have in the district, we have our counselors throughout the district that are part of that. And so if parents are interested, and we also have parents that show interest in that, whether it's concerns that have come up at home or at school or just general information, education, they typically reach out to either us as administration or the counselors, and they can certainly give you the information to get signed up. And we have them at several different schools throughout Boise, and so at different times, so it really just depends on your location, what's going to be best for you, but certainly those are available and they are free to our families.
And I will say, with the classes, I've gotten some really good feedback from some students this year that their attendance at those classes was very beneficial and instrumental in them quitting it. So I have gotten some positive feedback from those classes.
Okay, so thank you very much. This concludes the principal portion. So we can give a hand clap to So we'll dismiss these guys and have our medical people come up. If you would like to stay and hear the medical presentation, you can. You could also go to the gym and see things that are happening there. The medical panel will be on again later in the evening. So we'll just take about a 5-minute break at the most and get our medical team up here and get questions of them. So if you have questions from a medical standpoint, would encourage you to go ahead and write those down now. And then, again, put your hand up there and we'll come get those. So we have some really good experts that I think will prove quite helpful for us. Okay, so again, thank you for staying for this next session here. We have 3 medical experts in the area of vaping. So our first guest is Dr. Jennifer Shawls, and she is the medical director for St. Luke's Heart Health and Rehabilitation, as well as the Care Transitions Program. She helps patients with congestive heart failure be successful at managing their health at home. She's also medical director of St. Luke's Outpatient Tobacco Treatment Clinics. She serves on the National Expert Committee for the American Association of Cardiovascular Pulmonary Rehabilitation and is a member of St. Luke's Heart and Vascular Board. We also have Kimberly Polson. She's a registered nurse currently at Roosevelt and Washington Elementary Schools here in Boise. In the past, she has worked at the Boise VA Medical Center Emergency Department, St. Luke's Pediatric and Adult Emergency Departments, and St. Luke's Cardiac Research. She has also worked in maternal health, child health in Nicaragua as a Peace Corps volunteer, and also served as this is not a misprint, South Pole Logistics Coordinator living and working in Antarctica. That's pretty awesome. And all I am is from Priest River. That's all I got for you. Then our third panelist is Margie Sony, and she is a nurse practitioner for Idaho Pulmonary St. Luke's and Associate Director of the Nicotine Dependence, thank you, treatment program. So again, we'll hear from our medical people right now, and again, if you have questions, please write them down, raise your hand, but I also have a question already that came to me. So the first question is vaping safer than smoking?
Okay, so vaping seems to have less amount of toxins than the 6,000 toxins or such that combustible tobacco has. However, we haven't had very much experience with vaping. We've had decades and decades and decades of experience with tobacco and its effects. We've had less than 10 years experience looking at vaping and its effects. And so it certainly has a lot of toxins in it, even though the amount may be less than combustible tobacco. And the health effects are already starting to arise, such as increasing asthma attacks and exacerbations in children, decreasing their immune system and putting them at increased risk for colds and flus. Of course, we can talk later about the nicotine effects on the brain, but in terms of the vape materials themselves, they have formaldehyde, acrolein, heavy metals, and flavorings that a person is, the FDA says is okay to eat, but no one has ever said anything about the safety of inhaling flavorings into your lungs. So there's a really a suspicion amongst most medical people in the medical community that it's going to end up being just as harmful as tobacco, or nearly as harmful as tobacco.
And I would just add, I work with patients who have been long-term smokers of combustible cigarettes, and the way I phrase it to them is the lungs are not, they're incredibly fragile, and they are not designed to inhale anything hot like that. So anything you inhale that is heated, whether it be water or any kind of vapor or toxins that are in these, is not helpful for your lungs. And you're also inhaling the nicotine, which is giving you the rush that's giving you the addiction. And kids are, what is it, 4 times more likely to end up smokers if they start vaping. They end up smokers when they're adults.
And on a completely different note, when you look at vaping and Juuls, it's targeted directly toward kids. So the media is definitely putting lots of money into targeting children. So that's making it just as effective as cigarettes were in the 50s, where they made sure they targeted the media toward that population demographic. So they're targeting our children in that population demographic to try to get them to think it's cool, it'll give you satisfaction. And if you look at any of the social media sites, you'll see Juuls everywhere. People are designing purses that coach Prada that you can carry. Coachella had tons of information with people vaping.
Thank you. So the next question, boy, this is a really good one that just came from the audience. Is there any reason to treat vaping as different from other addictions?
So that's a great question. You know, we haven't had a lot of research yet behind what would be the difference between treating someone who vapes and someone who uses combustible tobacco. But I'll tell you that we have changed the name of our tobacco treatment program at St. Luke's to the Nicotine Dependence Treatment Program because it finally dawned on us. Well, we knew that it was the nicotine dependence that we're really treating, but honestly, it dawned on us that we had to be more inclusive because we have people who are addicted, these are adults, addicted to vaping that can't get off of it and who are seeking treatment from us. And so we are actually kind of treating them a little bit in the dark because these products, as you probably already know, are not regulated. Most of them, almost 100% of them, have nicotine in them, but we have no idea how much nicotine. And in the case of Juul, every single one of the Juuls has nicotine in them. The Juuls actually have as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes, and we don't know how much nicotine a person is getting per day when they inhale these. And so we have to sort of use our nicotine replacement products, as well as with adults we use bupropion and Chantix to try to use the same tools that we use for combustible tobacco. With teens, it's really unknown how we should treat them. We have to say probably this similar to the way we treat adults, maybe not the patches, but using nicotine replacement as needed products to help with the addiction, to help with the urges, to help get them off of the vape. But the nicotine is one of the most addictive substances on earth. So everyone needs to be clear that we have mass addiction going on right now with vaping. That is what's happening in our children. Yeah.
So Emory University just released a study looking at, let's see how old these kids were, age 11 to 21, with different substances. So they looked at nicotine, marijuana, and alcohol. On functional MRI, kids who used any of those substances had lower volumes of gray matter. So before age 21, you're shrinking your brains. So that's when I think about marijuana, alcohol, nicotine, the 3 most common drugs used in kids, I don't see a difference in how it's impacting their brains. And in fact, the nicotine makes it that much more addictive, and so they're more likely to go on and abuse nicotine, where they are less likely to go on necessarily, statistically speaking, and be alcoholics or continue to use marijuana later in life. And I think the other piece to remember in there is that the prefrontal cortex in kids is, as you know, not fully developed, right? They're they're crazy. And so that impulse control, that reward center overrides their impulse control because it's not everything else isn't fully developed yet. So the nicotine hits, all those substances hit their reward center and cause that addiction. There's other studies that show that use of any substances, nicotine, marijuana, alcohol, leads children to develop as adults bipolar disorder, Athena out there, tell me if ADHD, other mental health disorders, depression. So they're remodeling their brains in adolescence and triggering these mental health disorders later on, which increases the risk of addiction, yeah.
And one comment to my colleagues is nothing is regulated. The EU does have regulations in which they control the amount of nicotine that is per milligram per mil. In the United States, we don't have that. And actually, if you look online, you'll find, and kids know this, I spoke to secondary nurses, that kids make their own vape juice. So there's no way to control how much nicotine is going in there. How much of also the other additives that you'll find in order to put into the vape juice to give out the flavors. So with regulation, with basis, we may have a better idea of how much nicotine and how much of these other detrimental toxins that they're ingesting are actually coming in.
So, Nurse Polson, you teed that up perfectly for me. I know earlier you had mentioned that even just taking in straight water vapor can be dangerous when it's heated. And so I think this is the big misconception. So if you could address this, maybe elaborate on some of the things all three of you had mentioned. Isn't vaping just inhaling water?
Absolutely not. This is what people really have a misconception about. It is not water vapor. It is not something as benign as that. This is an aerosol of particles. And think about what Margie said about the lungs being so fragile. And you're putting tiny, tiny little particles, really it's a smoke, honestly, into your lungs, into the crevices of your lungs. Nothing good comes of that. And so, no, it is not a water vapor. It not only contains little tiny particles with heavy metals, like I was saying, it contains the carcinogens, which are formaldehyde and acrolein, and then these flavorings, like I was saying. We have instances of something called popcorn lung. I don't know if anyone's heard of this, where people were working in a microwave popcorn factory, and there was a caramel flavoring being used, and that flavoring, these individuals, a lot of them developed cancer that they linked to this particular flavoring. That flavoring is being used in vape. Our kids are putting that vape flavoring into their lungs. So no, it's not water vapor.
So the next question is, I've heard that kids can become sick from this, and there's been reported instances of this. What causes this to happen of kids getting sick?
Well, like I mentioned before, you can have, especially kids who are prone to asthma, you can have asthma exacerbations for sure. People can have immune system suppression or respiratory immune system suppression, where there increased likelihood of having colds or flu, coughing, etc. We mentioned already the idea that they may develop problems with concentration, problems with learning, problems with memory. There's all of that. But there's been a lot of near fatal instances, or I don't know if there's been any fatalities with young children getting into these products and drinking them. I'm talking like toddlers and very young children drinking these things that are flavored, and they have high amounts of nicotine in them, and having to go into the emergency department being treated for poisoning. That happens as well. There's been also instances, I'm sure everyone's heard about, some of these have blown up. The lithium batteries have exploded. That's why you can't have them on planes now. That's caused burns and other things.
And right here in our own ICU in Boise, we've had instances of, I don't know the age of the patients, but were in the intensive care unit here in Boise, Idaho, with vaping-related pneumonias, illnesses, and other effects of vaping. So, yeah.
And one of the things, when you vape, you get a sense of calm too. So nicotine promotes a euphoria, a sense of calm. So kids, what they're seeing at schools is prior to testing, kids are very anxious about testing. So they'll vape to try to calm themselves for the test. But then in actuality, they vape so much that they become tachycardic, their heart rate rises, their breathing increases, and they get very anxious. They're anxious about the test, they're anxious about how their body is coming. So then they present to the nurse's office. They'll never admit to vaping, but you can see the after effects of that.
Again, if you have questions out in the audience, please write those down, raise your hands, and we will make sure that those get answered. So there's three terms that come up, and maybe just if you could clarify for us. There's vaping, juuling, and e-cigarettes. Are those the same thing? Are they different? Can you address those?
Yeah, they're all the same thing. And actually, there's I'll just pass it along because there's so many terms. It's hard to keep up. And if you go into the gym after our session here, you're going to be shocked at what you thought was an inhaler is actually a $98 e-cigarette. If you look at these pens, you think it's a ballpoint pen, it's an e-cigarette. If you look at one of our staff from St. Luke's, who's a respiratory therapist, she's wearing a sweatshirt with tabs where they vape the tabs. It's a vaping sweatshirt. And by the way, you can buy these online. You can say you're over 18 to buy them, or you can say you're under. Didn't you buy something?
I didn't buy, but they let me into the website.
Yeah, let you into the website. You're not supposed to be let into the website if you're under 18, but they let you in anyway. So there's it's just a huge joke, and it's extremely scary. Wait till you see some of these products. It's going to blow your socks off, and they're all the same thing. Juul is particularly onerous because it looks like a jump drive. She has one right here. 70% of the people vaping now are using Juul because it doesn't have very much. You can't see the aerosol that comes out of it, so it's very secretive. It looks like a jump drive, and it is very, very potent with nicotine. In fact, the Juul company changed the nicotine salts to make the absorption of those salts even more rapid and more powerful than smoking cigarettes. And they are advertising to children directly. The Juul website it will be very informative if, as parents, you get on that website. Anything else?
So the other piece of it is, and Kim alluded to this earlier, is the social media presence that these guys have. So I just got on this fabulous, cool website called Candy Pen, Candy with a K, where Dr. Dre, DJ Khaled, all the coolest hip-hop artists are touting them in their music videos. They're getting sponsored by the vape companies to be in their, and they'll have an array of products on their website. Most of them look like a ballpoint pen. Some are made of mahogany, and they're made of rose gold, and they're gorgeous. But then you have a picture of DJ Khaled, like, whoa, he's selling them, and the kids want to look cool, so they use them. Hookahs, vapes, e-cigarettes, e-pipes. There's a zillion vape pens, mods, ends. The kids call them everything, and they all look different. There's something like 7,000 different products or some version of that all can contain vape, marijuana, crushed up pills, whatever you want.
And they call them by the company's name. So some of them out there are Blue, B-L-U, Bo is another one, Juul is a company. So
Candy sells super cool brimmed hats. There's all sorts of product around it, so
right.
They're promoting it.
And I wanted to say one more thing that Kim mentioned. I think it was Kim that this is one of the biggest problems. We thought we were getting rid of cigarettes in our youth, and we were. I mean, the rate of cigarette smoking has dropped dramatically, and a lot of kids think cigarette smoking is disgusting, but they find these products so acceptable, so socially acceptable, and the problem is that anyone who uses these products, that now it's starting to normalize this idea of smoking. Okay, it's normalizing it socially, but and they can do it anywhere. But also, keep on saying they're so full of nicotine, they're getting nicotine dependent. Many of them, 1 in 4, will be known to try cigarettes. but then 1 in 3, they say, will actually, who try it, will then start to become a cigarette smoker for life. So I think that's a really big thing to point out, is that now we're going to have that on top of it. Now our cigarette smokers are going to start going up instead of down for the first time in many, many, many years.
When we talk about the devices, as Margie showed you, this device has been found at schools tucked in the toilet paper rolls. And I consulted with the Nampa School District. I consulted with Boise Unified School District. So when I speak of a schools, I'm not necessarily just referring to Boise School District. So it's an epidemic in Idaho, not just here. They pass it around because it is odorless. They're able to inhale. That a teacher caught them passing their Juul around in class because it's so discreet. It fits in your sleeve. You can easily just and then just pass on. So
is anyone here outraged? You can feel the outrage that we have having to deal with this.
Yeah, thank you. So you've talked a little bit about the nicotine that's involved and the amounts of that can be super concentrated. Would you now just address, does nicotine affect the adolescent brain like other drugs and alcohol? And if so, how?
Well, I think we've kind of mentioned that. So nicotine, so the brain is growing until the age of 25. And we know that in the younger adolescent ages, the brain is so much more susceptible to the effects of addiction. And nicotine becomes that much more severe. They become that much more severely addicted to nicotine when they start in their teenage years versus starting in adult years. And this is for any form of nicotine. But as we also mentioned, Margie was saying that there are some studies showing that brain function is being affected in a negative way. We already know that when pregnant women should not be vaping either, or smoking, because it has negative effects on their child, their unborn child as an adult. It increases their risk of addiction, and it increases their risk of having ADHD, having other sort of mental health issues, concentration and learning problems.
And I think another part of that resonates with me is that because the prefrontal cortex is not yet fully developed, that sensitivity in adolescent brains to nicotine, which, as Dr. Schall's was noting, is one of the most potent addictive quality substances on the planet. There was a study that some youth, and I really like this phrase, so I'm going to directly quote it, lose autonomy over nicotine before they reach a 2 cigarette a day habit. So 2 cigarettes a day is 20 puffs on a Juul. So by the time they're going through 20 puffs on a Juul, they can't quit. And in our nicotine dependence treatment center, we are now seeing people who started vaping and are coming to us for treatment to get off vaping because they started as youth.
One more thing I wanted to say was that most kids are not just experimenting. Most kids that are vaping 20 out of 30 days out of the month. Okay? So think about that. It's not just, now, okay, I will mention that my child, Mr. McKenna, she's under your care, did mention that she tried vaping a couple years ago, strawberry flavored, and didn't know what the big deal was. That's what she says. I hope, but I don't know. I hope that she's not vaping. But most kids who are vaping regularly, 20 out of 30 days of the month average.
I'm so glad Dr. Schultz mentioned that, because there was a study in 2016, the National Youth Tobacco Survey, that found that 10% of youth found no harm if they vaped at all. 62% caused little to no harm, and then 28% believed caused harm only when used some days, but not on a daily basis. That's their perceived perception right now. They're not aware of how much nicotine and how addictive these substances are to their body.
And one last thing to note is that I have this is what's really shocking. It came out in the fall that e-cigarette use, this is from the CDC, e-cigarette use among high school students increased 78% in 1 year, from 2017 to 2018.
All right, a question from our audience. It's an excellent one. Is there any difference between vaping THC and smoking combustible marijuana?
I will say that it's all considered toxin as far as the body's concerned. I don't know. I would say that we don't even have a lot of research yet on the effects of combustible marijuana on cardiovascular disease and other kind of chronic diseases that we deal with that we commonly associate with tobacco use, right? Because it hadn't been socialized. Culturally, we haven't seen mass amounts of people using it yet. But I suspect that we will, and there is research going on combustible marijuana. But I would say also that vaping anything where you're getting particulate matter into your lungs is probably going to prove to cause disease, interstitial lung disease or other respiratory conditions that are dangerous. But I don't know that we have enough data yet on all of that.
So time for one more question, then maybe give each one of you some closing thoughts. So we know a lot about secondhand combustible smoke. What about secondhand vape for non-vaping people?
There was just a study published that looked at they asked kids, middle school and high school kids, have you been exposed to inside or outside secondhand smoke, whether it's from vaping or tobacco? And the answer was yes, for about 55% of all middle schoolers and high schoolers have been exposed to secondhand smoke from any of these substances. The problem with vaping is that, yes, that secondhand smoke is dangerous. Remember that those people who are using it are sucking all that stuff into their own bodies, but the aerosol that's being emitted absolutely is considered dangerous secondhand smoke. It contains all of the same stuff. Cancer-causing agents like formaldehyde, acrolein, these heavy metals. There is nicotine, of course, in it, etc. So that is why it's very important to have smoke-free policies. Like we just talked to some BSU students who said that BSU does not include vaping yet in their smoke-free policy. The secondhand smoke from vaping or aerosol from vaping is considered dangerous as well. We should consider it that way.
And that's echoed in the Surgeon General's advisory on e-cigarette use in youth. They just did I'm sure you guys all heard about this, the Surgeon General just put out this advisory talking about the e-cigarette vaping epidemic in our youth, citing studies that showed that they can expose both themselves and bystanders to other harmful substances, as Dr. Schulz was just mentioning. So there is a real risk if your kid is sitting next to a kid who's vaping, or an adult.
So we're just about finished with this portion of the panel, but maybe if we just it's awesome because you have a captive audience and we know you're very passionate about this subject. So if each of you would maybe take about 30 seconds and go, what is it that you really want us to take away from this?
It's not harmless, and it's very harmful, and it's a deliberate effort of big tobacco, frankly, to create an entire generation of addicts who are also going to die of chronic disease that we're not going to be able to afford to treat.
I would like to, number two is to say that it's rampant. And you may think your kid is not vaping, and you think your kid hasn't tried it, and that may be true and it may not be true. Given our statistics, it's easy to hide, it's easy to put other stuff in, and so talk to your children, ask them questions. Be subtle about it and say, hey, do any of your friends vape? What do they think about it? Get them talking on the subject. There's a ton of great websites out there for parents, and you can always contact at least myself, and if you have any further questions, and on how to have this conversation with your kids, because they don't think it's harmful, just like we didn't think cigarettes were harmful 50 years ago.
And I'm an elementary school nurse. I've not seen any vaping at all. But all of the kids, when I'm in their lessons and doing health lessons, everyone in elementary, 5th and 6th grade specifically, are aware of what vaping is. They know the devices, they know the terms, they know it has different flavors. They've seen people, either older siblings or adults, vaping, so their exposure is getting to be as deep and rich as our exposure.
Sorry, last thing is that the vape stores, if you're, the law is that if you look under 27, they're supposed to ask for your ID when you're buying vapes. Statistically speaking, 65% of children under 18 are buying their own. So they're not asking. I went in and they didn't ask me, and I think I look under 27. So
I would agree with that.
Okay, just one last question that came up. Can you do any home testing to see if your child's been vaping? Is there a home test that could catch or identify vaping?
No, unfortunately. I mean, with nicotine, we can pick that up on a swab on the inside the cheek or in urine, but I don't know about.
Those swabs might be able to pick up the nicotine in the.
That's true.
in the vaping.
Yeah, they're testing for nicotine, so I suppose so, but I don't know how they're. I have no idea if they're available. I mean, we use it medically. Well, actually, I'll tell you what, our employee program uses it to see if for benefits. You know, if people are smokers, they have to pay more for their health insurance. So, and they're testing for nicotine, so that's right. So it is testing for nicotine, but I don't know that they're available for over the counter.
I want to thank our panel so much, but before we dismiss them, just wanted to let you know that in just a few minutes, Councilmember Holly Woodings is going to give our keynote. It's just about a 10-minute speech that she's going to have, so I would encourage you to stick around for that. If you can't, that's fine. You can head out the doors and you can go down the hallway, and we have in the gymnasium all these examples of Juuls and e-cigarettes and vaping devices and things, so I'd really encourage you to take advantage of that. Other than that, stick around here, and Councilmember Holly Woodings will start in just a minute. Let's give a big clap for our panel. Thank you guys so much. While we're waiting, I was just reminded that if you go to the cafeteria or the gymnasium later, there's counselors there. So people know that can help you get started if you want to have this conversation with your children or you're not sure how to start it. We have people available that are experts in that area and would gladly sit with you and help you get started. So again, we'll start with Councilmember Holly Woodings in just a moment. So I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Holly Woodings. She was elected to the Boise City Council in November of 2017 and began her term in January 2018. Holly believes that Boise is a great place to raise a family, start or grow a business, and inspire the next generation of young leaders. Keeping our community strong and sustainable is what drives her to give back through public service. A graduate of Boise State University, she served as a state representative for District 19 in Idaho's 72nd legislature. She has also volunteered for many local organizations, including Boise State Venture College, New Leadership Idaho, and the 2012 Yes for Boise Schools campaign. Holly's other community service includes serving as a board chair for the Girl Scouts Silver Sage, a board member of the Boise State Foundation, and on the board of advisors for Idaho Women in Leadership. I am pleased to introduce Boise Council member Holly Woodings.
Thank you. I'm going to stick this in here. I actually prepared comments because I don't have a very long time, and so I tend to get verbose if I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a really important issue, and education is always kind of the first step in understanding what we need to do. And it's a hugely impactful issue for our students today. And I'm here to say I'm not the most expert person that you're going to hear from tonight. I'm probably the least expert person, but I have kids, so I know it always doesn't seem like we're being listened to. But I'll tell you that we still have a huge influence in their lives. And the example that we set is probably one of the most important ways that we have that influence. By leading healthy lives and talking with our kids about what vaping actually is and how it impacts our bodies, we give them the information that they need to make informed decisions. But we as a community also need to lead by example. If we say it's okay to vape and not okay to smoke, that's setting the tone that vaping is safe, which health experts, who are just sitting right here, have demonstrated to us that it's just not true. Currently, the city of Boise is in the process of updating our smoke-free air ordinance to prohibit vaping and the use of e-cigarettes in public places, such as city parks, on the Greenbelt, within 20 feet of public entrances, and other places where smoking is already prohibited. When the smoke-free air ordinance was passed in 2011, which was before my time on council, the opposition to the ordinance was deafening. Boise businesses said that they would have to close their doors if they couldn't allow smoking. Businesses in neighboring cities rejoiced that they may see a windfall of new customers from displaced smokers. People protested losing the freedom to smoke where they pleased. In the end, the city council did the right thing to protect the air we breathe in public places, but they specifically exempted vaping since it was a new technology at the time. Fast forward 8 years to just last week when city council voted to add vaping to the ordinance. All those who came in front of city council were in support of the change, citing that we know more now about the health concerns of vaping and the secondhand vapors, talking about its impact on clean air, talking about the lack of differentiation between smoking and vaping, talking about how it can be a gateway for young people to move on to cigarettes. It's clear that people understand clean air and the impacts of vaping. And to go back to that 2011 testimony, none of those scenarios played out. In fact, smoking in public places is now prohibited in more cities than ever. Many of them are neighbors. Most businesses have also been disallowing vaping alongside smoking as a business choice, and now they'll have a city ordinance to back it up. Adding vaping to the ordinance wasn't actually my idea. I was only the messenger. Several months back, I was contacted by a Greenbelt patrol volunteer who had an issue. Smokers who used the Greenbelt were upset because they had to endure people's vapor plumes, but smoking still wasn't allowed. Those users saw smoking and vaping as two delivery systems for the same result and called out the unfairness of the ordinance. The Greenbelt volunteers didn't like the plumes any more than anyone else, and so one of them reached out to me for a possible resolution. I also heard from the Cancer Action Network, who was interested in providing more context around vaping and support of the change. After talking in a public meeting with the Parks and Recreation Commission, since one of the ordinances relates specifically to our parks, and receiving an enthusiastic recommendation to change the ordinance, I was contacted by health professionals, citizens, park users, senior organizations, and many others who also support the change. They recognize the positive impact of clean air for all, and many showed up in front of City Council and the mayor to voice that support. Our final reading of the ordinance to prohibit vaping and the use of e-cigarettes will be May 7th. And then Boiseans can enjoy air free from vapor just as we've enjoyed smoke-free air for the past years while enjoying our public spaces in Boise. My family and I are all looking forward to having a smoke and vape-free beach to enjoy at Esther Simplot Park this summer. And if you need to find us on a weekend, it's most likely that we'll be there. Thank you so much for caring enough to be here tonight. Thanks to all the folks who are providing much needed information and all the SROs, teachers, administrators, health professionals, and others who are on the front lines of enforcement. Together, we can send the message that vaping is not safe, does not belong in the hands of our kids, and doesn't belong in our shared air. Thank you very much.
So this includes kind of the round one. Again, we'll be doing a repeat presentation of the principal panel as well as the medical panel. But why I do have your attention, I do want to give a shout out to Amanda Kuznia. She's over here and she has put this on and we are so grateful for her leadership. She has spent countless hours organizing everything, and so I doffed my cap to you. Thank you so much. All right, we'll start the principal panel in just a few minutes. Thank you very much. Sound, did you guys ever get this? Okay, we'll go ahead and get started on the next session with our principal panel. So again, up here, we have ready for some questions. And again, if you just came in or you just joined us and you have some questions, if you'd go ahead and write those down, we still have people in here that can get them for you. But if not, we have some questions already generated from the last workshop as well. So we have with us Trevor McKenna. He's the vice principal at Boise High, and Janet Cherry. She is the principal of West Junior High. So the first question for our panel is, what are the consequences if my child is caught vaping at school?
Hi, thanks for coming out tonight. The consequences when students are caught at vaping at school are really twofold. We really encourage the education piece, which is a tobacco cessation course in the event that they're vaping. And when students and parents enroll in the tobacco cessation course, the amount of time that the students are suspended out of school is reduced. So if a parent and student enroll in the tobacco cessation course, which is 6 weeks, 2 hours once weekly for that time period, students are given in-house suspension for 2 days, and they're suspended out of school for 1 day. And in addition to that, we will also get our school resource officer involved, and the students will get a tobacco citation as well.
And just kind of to add to that, it's always our goal, obviously, as educators to make sure we're educating students about the dangers of tobacco, drugs, alcohol, and also parents. And I think that's one of the biggest things, the way our policy is written, is to highly encourage that. We don't want students out of school ever. Sometimes there's a reason for it. We need that. But our goal is always to try and reduce that suspension and obviously educate students and parents. So that's the way our policy is set up, I think works very well. And giving students and parents the opportunity to learn about, for this case, the examples of vaping is super important because of a lot of the misconceptions out there. They were discussed earlier about vaping isn't as dangerous as smoking, and letting students understand and parents know that is just not true. And so those classes really do a good job of educating our parents and our students. So I think I'm glad that we can provide that rather than just say, here's a consequence, but here's also some classes you can take and some resources to help you not make that poor decision again.
Okay, so this next question was kind of written this way. It's how big of a problem, but I'd like to reframe it. And can you just kind of describe the problems that vaping presents at the school? So what is the problem? Give us some kind of the ins and outs of that.
Well, I think one of the major problems that I see at Boise High that vaping presents is that a lot of times it's keeping kids from being in class. So, you know, I think with the levels of nicotine that some of the medical professionals described earlier, you know, we're seeing students with addiction issues, particularly addiction to nicotine. So it's impacting them in the classroom. It's taking them out of the classroom so they can access that nicotine. So I think that's the biggest impact that I see is the impact that it's having on students and their learning. And then obviously the health effects as well.
And I echo all of that. And I think also, I think this was mentioned earlier too, the impact on the students who aren't vaping. I always look at that. They should be able to go into a restroom and not see another student vaping, or be in a classroom and not look over and see their classmate vaping. It really, I think, puts those students in a tough situation too. I know we talked to teachers too about vaping, and I've had teachers, you know, a year or two ago that said, oh, no student would ever vape in my class. I would know if they were vaping. Unfortunately, kids are vaping in class without the students or without the teacher knowing, because like the panel talked about earlier, they're small, they're disguised in, I don't know, what 7,000 different ways, or what was that number? And so, and because of how they're used, it can happen right in a classroom. And I think that's, it's also an epidemic not only for the students vaping, but for the whole classroom atmosphere. We want our teachers being able to focus on the education of students, and they also have to look out for students vaping on their cell phones. So there's a big task for our teachers as well.
Thank you. Next, if you could describe, what are the schools doing to educate children about vaping. So maybe you could talk about certain classes or where it's in the curriculum, whether it's just kind of anecdotally through student council meetings. Just tell us how that's being addressed in education about vaping.
I can address one component, and then I can pass it on to Ms. Cherry to expand on that. But at the high school level, all the students are required to take health as part of a graduation requirement. And there is a built-in unit on vaping that the students go through. And this year we had students that were actually producing anti-vaping videos as part of the education. And we have a summit at Boise High School every year that's a student-led summit where the students are picking topics of interest based around a central theme, and then other students and teachers attend those presentations. And we had a student group that put on a presentation about vaping and the dangers of vaping and the problems that vaping is causing. And it was actually one of our highly attended presentations for the day. So that is one component.
And at the junior high level, students will have to take health in 8th grade, and it's also a component of that curriculum. And it's also talked about in the PE classes, just talking about healthy lifestyles. And so we try and get it in a bunch of different ways. I think the area that we struggle in is, I'd say the social media piece, because kids are getting all kinds of mixed messages that way, or just wrong messages, not even mixed, about vaping is the thing to do. And I think we're always looking for new ways to connect with students and to get that message across in a way that they'll understand. And so that's what we're looking at, is trying to, we understand students don't always listen to adults because they know everything and we don't. So we're trying to figure out a way to educate students about it in a way that they'll actually listen to. And that social media seems to be the piece that we're trying to go at West. And I think with the other junior high principals, we've gotten together trying to talk about that as well, of what kind of media we can use that's going to connect with students.
Yeah, and I would also just add to that we're not looking at just a school problem, and we're not just looking at a problem that's occurring at the home. It's really a community problem that needs to be addressed as a community. And I think if we're waiting to educate our students in junior high or high school on the dangers of vaping, I think we've waited too long and missed the boat. So I think another key component is early intervention and early education, starting at the elementary schools.
And I can verify that it's taking place. In fact, one of our panel members talked about that, and I think Nurse Polson will be directing it again, how it's taught in the elementary grades. So the next is kind of twofold, or they're maybe one and the same. Is one, how are kids getting vapes? And then what should a parent be looking for? Like, how can I tell if my kid is vaping?
Well, I'll address the first question of how students are getting vapes, and I think there are countless number of ways that students are getting vapes. They will buy them from people on the street. They will go into stores and buy them illegally. For whatever reason, they're able to do that. And I've heard a growing number of students that we've been talking to, as we've been catching them, because that's an interesting question to me. And there's an increasing number of students that I've been having telling me that they're actually just buying them online. And the medical professionals that were up here earlier mentioned that too. It's not that they're providing some sort of identification and verification how old they are. It's, you click in the drop-down box and you say that you're of age, and they're able to access that that way as well.
Yeah, I think they're getting them all different ways. We have, they take their parents' vapes, bring them to school. Older brothers and sisters, they get them that way. And I think getting them from each other. I think the one way now that we've seen more and more of in talking with kids, and I think that's one thing we're all trying to do now, is to understand how we can help students. We also have to figure out what is their motivation behind it. And so I know we all try and ask some of those questions, like, where'd you get it? And not just to be curious, so we can also kind of head that off. And online seems to be one of the growing ways students are getting vapes now.
And as far as how you can tell if your student is vaping or not, I think that's a real difficult thing to tell just by virtue of the fact that they're largely odorless and they're so small. But I would say as a parent, you know, you have a right to know what's going on with your kiddos, and you have a right to know what's in their backpacks and in their drawers at home. And so I think, you know, just knowing what your kiddos are up to and paying really, really close attention is one way.
So one of the things, if you could address, like, so what happens, like, so a lot of times school grounds becomes tricky. Like they're at a track meet across town, or maybe they're at a school dance that doesn't even take place on the school grounds themselves. It's down at the Owyhee Plaza or something. Can you talk about kids and the consequences for vaping if they're not at school? Is it still something they're in trouble for?
The consequences are still the same because any school-sponsored activity, whether it's on campus or not, is treated the same way. Like I said, that goes for a football game, it goes for a choir concert, it goes for the school bus stop. That's also a big one. Is kids think, well, I'm not at school, and they're standing out for the bus, and we'll get calls. You know, kids are out vaping, waiting for their bus. It was a little tricky when it was cold out because we would get lots of calls, and we found out that it was just that it was really cold. So that was kind of threw us for a loop for a while. But I think those are areas too. Kids think, well, I'm not at school yet. But those are areas that are kind of where kids, they congregate and they do that stuff. We found that kids were hiding their vapes at their bus stop, so they weren't bringing them to school. But they would get to the bus stop early, and then they would vape, hide their vape, and then get on the school bus.
And then the last question for the evening before we transition to our other panel is, and it came up last time, but what can parents do? Let's say that even their child has not been caught vaping, but they would like them to be involved in a cessation class. Is that something they can access, and if so, how can they do that?
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously as schools, you know, we're a central part of the community, and, you know, our number one priority is to, you know, help students be successful and provide resources to families. So it's not uncommon whatsoever to have parents call and express concern over their child and the potential of them vaping. And so, yeah, we absolutely make those tobacco cessation courses or the survival courses that are more geared towards drug and alcohol abuse available to parents and students, and we'll sign them up free of charge whenever requested, and provided space in the class.
Well, I believe this year we had to add several more classes for the tobacco cessation. I don't know the exact number, but it seemed like every time we would call to set up, get a student in there, it's, well, that class is full. And so so I think that's why we see it as an epidemic. It is happening, and it is something that we want to make sure and provide those resources for our students. And so having those additional classes has been really helpful because they are happening almost immediately then. And the students are getting those, and the students and parents are getting that information they need.
Okay, Vice Principal McKenna and Principal Cherry, just with your last few seconds or so, what is it that you really would like parents to know? So maybe just kind of your parting words of wisdom to us.
Well, it's a major problem, and we need to work together as a school and as a community to help intervene and educate our students and prevent this from coming in our school buildings. School buildings should be a safe place for students to come and access their education and not be exposed to these types of things. And so I think it's really important that we open up the dialogue like we're doing tonight, and we work together to make a difference with our kids.
And I agree wholeheartedly. And I think the other thing we need to do is make sure we're talking to our kids and having that open, honest conversation. I think one of the panelists mentioned earlier, asking your child, have you vaped, or have you seen kids at school vape? Are your friends vaping? Are you vaping? And to have that open dialogue with them. And then also, like I said, trying to stay on top of all of the trends between social media, vaping, different devices and everything. It's daunting and it can be overwhelming. And I know there are days when we find a vape that I haven't seen before. I think, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to keep on this? But we have to. We just can't say, oh, I can't keep up. We have to just keep going, and we have to work together. And I think combine our resources and make sure we're available and communicating with each other so that we have as much information as we can. And like I said, it's a partnership, and then we all need to be involved in.
All right, thank you very much. We appreciate you being our panel principals. Thank you very much. And we will have our medical panel up here in just a moment. Thank you very much. So we're going to start the last portion, and this panel presented before and was very, very informative. So our first guest is Dr. Jennifer Schals. Did I say that right? Schals. Schals. So I did not say that right. Schals. And she is I'm going to let her introduce herself because I think we had some inaccurate information. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. So I'm an internal medicine doctor, and I'm the medical director, system medical director for lifestyle medicine at St. Luke's, but I specifically have been asked to speak here because I'm the medical director of the nicotine dependence treatment program.
I'm Margie Sony. I'm a nurse practitioner. I am a nurse practitioner at St. Luke's, Idaho Pulmonary Associates, so I deal with all sorts of lung diseases. And I'm the associate medical director with Dr. Schals at the St. Luke's Nicotine Dependence Treatment Program.
Hi, I'm Kim Polson. I am a school nurse at Roosevelt in Washington, and I've worked in emergency room settings in the past.
So the first question we have tonight is, so kind of what's the big deal? Vaping is just kind of taking in water vapor. It's way safer than smoking. Why is there such an outcry?
There's an outcry for a number of different reasons. Vaping is not water vapor. It's called that, actually. The industry loves to call it vaping because they give that impression that it's just harmless water vapor. In fact, medical professionals like to call it what it is, which is an electronic cigarette. So it's using it's a battery to heat up a liquid that contains all kinds of substances that are toxic to the human body. One of the number one things that's in e-cigarettes is nicotine. And nicotine is one of the most addictive substances on earth, and most of these e-cigarettes contain nicotine. And we'll talk about that and its negative effects in a minute. But the other stuff that's in the liquids that people are inhaling, again, not water vapor, are particulate matter that contains formaldehyde, which is cancer-causing, acrolein, which is cancer-causing, heavy metals like nickel and tin, etc. There are flavorings. These are flavorings that are FDA approved for eating, but these are flavorings that people are now putting into their lungs directly, into their very fragile lung tissue, these little particles. And so this is not just water vapor. This is particulate matter that is going into the lung tissue.
And I think there's two other pieces to that. One, as I tell my patients in the lung clinic, there's nothing that's okay to inhale into your lungs. Your lungs are incredibly fragile. If you've ever seen an actual lung before, I don't know why you would have, but they're incredibly fragile and easy to tear and easy to break down. And anything you heat, it can be a smoke from a campfire, smoke from a burning house, smoke from anything, any inhaled heat is very damaging to the architecture, the structure of your lungs. The second piece is, in prep for this, I went online and started Googling what's in vape liquid. No one actually knows. So we know some of these things. They're breaking down the products in some of the testing labs, and we know some of these things that Dr. Schall's just mentioned. But in so many of the products, we have no idea, which is frighteningly similar to when cigarettes first came on the market. They were not required to tell us, and they are not. It's unclear what's actually in them. And I'm sure you all know this, but the major vape products are owned by Big Tobacco.
And also, if you consider e-cigarettes came on the market in 2005. We're now in 2018, and the Surgeon General's reports in 2011, 1% of girls the ages 12 to 24 reported trying vaping, 2% in boys. Now in 2018, we see an increase of 90% of girls and 23% of boys. So since 2005 to 2019, we're seeing a dramatic jump in our students and our children starting earlier and also being exposed to these harmful chemicals.
So again, Nurse Paulson, every time you say something, you kind of like tee it up for me. It's awesome. And we haven't even met before outside of this stage presentation here. So could you kind of address, so we hear the word vaping and we hear the word juuling and we hear the word e-cigarettes. Are they the same? Are they different? I know that came up last time and it was such you guys responded to that really well. If you could just address that.
Okay, so I would encourage anyone, I don't know if anyone from here has already gone into the gym, but I think you'll be shocked if you go in the gym, especially the St. Luke's, one of our respiratory therapists is over there, and she has all kinds of products. They're all the same. They're all e-cigarettes. So Juul is a company, and people call it a Juul, and here it is. You can see it looks like a flash drive or USB flash drive. And there's a aerosol that looks like a inhaler, like an albuterol inhaler. $98, you can get it online. It's an actual e-cigarette. There are pens that you can get that look like real fountain pens. Those are e-cigarettes. And I know Margie's going to talk about another one that some of the rock stars are promoting. There is our respiratory therapist over there, Gabby, is wearing a sweatshirt that has the strings that come out from the hoodie. You can actually vape. You could put vape materials or liquid into the hoodie and vape with your sweatshirt from those little ties. They're all the same. They're all dangerous. Do you want to talk about the rock stars?
Yes, but also there's things, hookahs, vapes, e-cigarettes. There's a zillion different kinds on the market, and the kids call them all different things. Pods, ends, whatever. What? Sorens, yeah. I was on, again, doing prep for this, and there's a bunch of different websites where you can get on and look at the social media for these products. One of them is called a candy pen, candy with a K because that's cute, and Dr. Dre, DJ Khaled, ASAP, all the cool hip rock artists or hip-hop artists, rappers out there are using vapes, are paid to use vapes in their videos so that the kids think it's cool. So I was shocked. I kind of like DJ Khaled, but not anymore.
And also in 2015, when Juuls came on the market, they revolutionized what vaping was. Prior, it used to be a big, I think you have a picture, Margie, don't you? Of a big cumbersome box that had a large cartridge that carried the vaping liquid, and it had a lot of smoke. So it was not easy to hide. When Juuls came on the market, they created a design that's easy to hide. It's odorless, so kids can actually vape just as if they're coughing into their sweater and pass it amongst people. Because what they did is they've increased the amount of nicotine that they have in their pods, in their vape juice, and they also used a nic salt in order to soothe the throat. So a lot of times if you have a higher amount of nicotine, your throat tends to burn. But with nic salts, when you inhale that percentage of nicotine, it's a smoother vape, and therefore it's not as painful. So Juul's kind of revolutionized, and they're one of the top companies on Forbes right now.
I guess we should mention that 70% of the people, Juul owns 70% of the market for e-cigarettes. 70%. That's how popular they are. They have very high concentrations of nicotine. One Juul pod has as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. But with this change in salts, where it makes it smoother, you can actually get a quicker, bigger hit of nicotine using a Juul than maybe even a cigarette. So they're really promoting mass addiction.
So with that, that was a great segue. So would you just spell, like, what are the dangers in nicotine, particularly in adolescent teenagers?
So nicotine, as I mentioned, is one of the most addictive substances on earth. But nicotine, teenage brains don't, human brains are not fully mature until 25. And it's in that adolescent time that brains are most susceptible to the effects of addiction. You're more sensitive to it, and it will promote addiction later on in life to other substances, not just nicotine. But in addition, it can interrupt concentration and focus and learning, and is associated with causing ADHD and other mental health issues down the road. So I know that each one of these guys has some additional comments on that.
So you can see me leafing through here a whole huge study on the short and long-term consequences of nicotine exposure during adolescence. They go into a lot of really long words, but the short version, as Dr. Schall's alluded to, the prefrontal cortex up until you're 25 is not fully developed, but the reward center is. So the reward center gets hit by the nicotine, the dopamine release in the brain, and it overwhelms the impulse control, right? That's why kids are experimenting and doing things like trying things, right? That's the whole point, is that it stimulates that reward center in the not fully formulated prefrontal cortex. Nothing personal, kids. It's on everybody until you're 25, right? So the effects of nicotine on that adolescent brain stimulate, so two things. One, it's a super quick addiction process in the not fully formed brain. So one study showed that kids can get addicted to nicotine, be unable to quit before they're up to a two cigarette a day, not 2-pack, 2 cigarette a day. That's 20 puffs on a Juul. If they're doing that most days out of a week, they're addicted already, and they're going to have trouble quitting. Not even it's a small portion of a cartridge, 10% of the cartridge, of a single cartridge, right? And then the second part of that is these kids go on to develop. So kids who are early on addicted to nicotine, actually marijuana and alcohol, or using nicotine, marijuana, and alcohol, not even addicted, go on to develop many mental health disorders. Bipolar disorder, depression, ADHD. There's some thought that there's an increased risk of other schizophrenia, those kinds of other very serious mental health disorders that are linked to any kind of substance abuse in the teenage brain.
I think also I reached out to my colleagues, the secondary school nurses at Boise Unified School District and Nampa District. What they're seeing is kids are using vaping. Initially, prior to tests, there's some anxiety generally, and they want to seek vaping prior to their tests for that sense of calm and euphoria that was associated with what Margie said. So they'll vape prior to a test, but then when it gets closer and the effects of the nicotine are wearing off or increasing, they are coming in with rapid heartbeat. They're coming in with difficulty breathing and an increased sense of anxiousness. So their anxiety in turn actually develops and triples.
Sorry, I forgot about this other study that linked nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana use in adolescent brains to an early reduction in gray matter in your brain. It literally shrinks your brain.
So the research on combustible secondhand smoke is clear. We've known that for a long time. What do we know about secondhand smoke for vaping?
So we know that it also is dangerous. So the secondhand smoke or secondhand aerosol, I guess, contains all of the things that the person themselves is inhaling. So it contains nicotine, it contains these cancer-causing agents that we talked about, it contains these flavorings that shouldn't be inhaled into the lungs. And so people being exposed secondhand, and by the way, there was a research project research that just came out in the last couple of weeks, said that about 50 to 55% of middle schoolers and high schoolers have been exposed both inside and outside to secondhand smoke, whether it's from vaping or tobacco products. So a huge percentage of our kids are being exposed, and we think of that secondhand smoke from vape or e-cigarettes as as harmful, just like the vape itself is harmful to the person using it.
So what I'd like to do for the last portion is just give each one of you are experts in this area, and clearly you're passionate about it. You're taking of your own time of your evening to do this, and we thank you so much for that. What is it kind of also we did with the principal panel? What are your words of wisdom or kind of parting thoughts for us?
I would say that there is mass addiction going on. Everyone needs to know that. It's being promoted by the tobacco companies, and that vaping, e-cigarettes, we're going to find out that it's going to cause a lot of chronic disease. It's making asthma worse in kids, respiratory conditions worse. It's changing their brains, and we're creating, like I said, an entire generation that will be developing chronic disease because of this mass addiction, and how are we going to pay for it?
So one statistic that stands out to me is 70% of kids, 67% of kids that they polled did not know or said they didn't think there was nicotine in Juuls, and every single Juul has nicotine in it. So talk to your kids, start the conversation. Kids, start the conversation. Talk to your friends. What I wish I had known when I was younger is that don't fool yourselves. This is the smoking that we dealt with when we were growing up. Don't fool yourselves. I hear a lot of kids saying, that's okay, it's not smoking. We know not to smoke cigarettes. That's disgusting. Vaping will also harm you. You will become addicted to nicotine very quickly, and you're 4 times more likely to start smoking cigarettes if you vape as a kid. So talk to your friends. What I wish I had known is I wish I had the ability to go back and talk to my patients now who are dying of lungs-related problems, COPD, severe asthma, ILD, interstitial lung disease, other lung diseases caused by inhaling hot stuff, so vaping. I wish I'd been able to, all of them started at 14 or 15. I don't have very few patients who've started after the age of 25. That's going to be the case with you guys. Every single one of my patients says, I wish I'd never started. I wish somebody had told me. I wish somebody had come down hard on me. But it's too late. They're dying.
No, thanks, Margie. I think that's really important. I think it's important to recognize that this industry, as my colleagues have mentioned, is targeting our children. They are specifically designing this product to serve them. And even me in elementary, we do not see vaping. We don't have that exposure, but we do have kids talking about vaping. They have seen it from either siblings, older siblings, or parents. Therefore, we need to have this education with kids openly, as my colleagues had said, and don't think just because they're young, they're not exposed to it. It's hitting them from all aspects of their life. And there is stuff that we can do. We as parents, as community leaders, as directors, we can advocate. Let's increase the legal age of how old you can be to buy vape. Let's ensure that you ask for identification when you go in to purchase. Let's try to put regulations on when they're trying to buy online vaping products to ensure that our children are safe. Because in the end, everyone wants to ensure that we have a better life.
So that concludes the evening. Thank you so much, panel. If we could give a round of applause for them. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. There is, if you wanted, in case you just have not been to the cafeteria or the gym, I think most of you have. If you wanted to stop by there, you're welcome to do so. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for coming tonight on this very important topic.